The following case was presented at the 4th National Symposium on Lacanian Psychoanalysis in Marseille. On April 12, 2001, Professor Laurent Panchou, a disciple of Jacques-Alain Miller, the principal continuer of Jacques Lacan's work concerning the study of the real, presented a curious case that occurred a year earlier in an apartment in the Saint-Mitre neighborhood. To understand the conceptualization of the real until then, it is necessary to refer to the definition of the impossible. In this sense, from the Lacanian doctrine, the phenomenon of the real could be understood as that plane of existence that borders everyday reality, which, through jouissance, can intrude into the plane common to human beings. This real can only be apprehended through traumatic experiences, which cause ruptures in everyday reality, allowing the real to enter or for people to come into contact with it. Since the real is impossible to symbolize with words or images, it manifests in ways that humans are capable of assimilating, including objects as mundane as an apple or a book. However, this does not mean that the real takes that form. In a particular event, most people will see the same thing, but others will see completely different objects under very strange conditions. Similarly, cameras could also capture the real in different ways. This was the case in 1989 with the mannequin incident in a clothing store in Toronto. The real, in symbolic appearance translated by cameras and the eyes of some people, took the form of a mannequin that severely affected human beings. However, its true form is indeterminate despite some captures being possible. Laurent Panchou personally followed the case of the Llopis family. Their residence was located on Avenue Chateau Gombert, where the entire case of Mrs. Cora Llopis, who was affected by the phenomenon of the real in one of the pension's rooms, unfolded. Due to force majeure, they had to leave their native Barcelona to settle in France. For economic reasons, Mrs. Cora Llopis and her 3 daughters had to rent a small apartment in a low-cost residence in Marseille. 3 weeks after moving in, Cora suffered from a severe flu that left her bedridden for over a week. According to her daughters, she deeply regretted this as she was eager to explore the city and find a job near the pension. Moreover, Cora repeatedly mentioned that she never liked the room she was in. She complained that it was excessively dark, even with the main light on or a bedside lamp. Furthermore, the apartment only had windows in the living room and the room where her 3 daughters slept, and these windows were unusually small in general. Cora's room was also somewhat damp, and the air was much heavier to breathe. When the daughters realized their mother was not improving, they tried to take her to an emergency health center. However, they found a room where it was completely impossible to see anything inside. The lights had stopped working despite the building having electrical power. Somehow, the bulbs emitted no light. Additionally, Mrs. Cora, who was bedridden, was not visible from any angle. The room had become engulfed in a substance of darkness that made contact with anything inside impossible. Eloisa, one of Cora Llopis's daughters, decided to call the emergency center for a home visit. This is where Laurent Panchou, a psychiatrist, entered the scene, specially sent to supervise the case after it became known at the hospital. Given the characteristics of what was happening, this could not be attributed to any condition of Cora or her 3 daughters. The pension attendant later revealed that she had always had problems with the rooms on the 3rd floor. Years ago, several people had suffered strange accidents there, mostly involving burns from metallic objects that seemed to have overheated inexplicably. Most strangely, these metallic parts ended up adhering to the skin. The description provided by the pension attendant reminded Professor Panchou of one of the first cases he had recorded, which related to the incident involving a homeless woman in the attic of an abandoned house in Paris. That case, occurring in 1991, involved a single woman who had been homeless since 1987. She suffered from severe alcoholism and had been reported a couple of times for causing disturbances in public. In September 1991, the police, after raiding a group that had occupied an abandoned house, searched the attic and found this woman, whose identity could only be confirmed 2 weeks later. Her body had completely turned to metal, to the extent that it initially appeared entirely unrecognizable in its human form. The police report of that case recorded the following. Patrol 1392 of the French National Police is dispatched to the commune of Épinay-sur-Seine following a report of illegal occupation at the address. The notification is recorded and the site is evacuated. 6 individuals, 3 men and 3 women, are arrested for later identification at the police station. However, among the individuals, it is indicated that a 7th person is in the attic of the building with severe symptoms of an illness whose name they do not know. When the police officers ascend to the attic, they find a room at clear risk of collapse, with partially demolished walls, water leaks, and an intense odor that draws significant attention. At that moment, an emergency call is made to the staff of Hôpital St. Louis after discovering a possible body with metallic characteristics. According to the testimony of the occupants, the woman in the attic had no chance of leaving as her illness had paralyzed her legs. A health procedure is noted for clarification with what was found. Laurent Panchou, who supervised this case while he was in Paris, determined with the help of Jacques Alain Miller's team that the case recorded by the police was indeed an effect of the real. This effect had taken over the attic room, corrupting the woman's body, which began with impaired walking ability and ended with a complete transformation into a substance of rare metals. The case of Mrs. Cora Llopis falls into the same category, where the primary entity affected by the real would be the room in the pension. Detailed and careful studies determined that only some rooms on the 3rd floor exhibited certain anomalies, with the loss of luminosity being the most significant. However, until then, no one had suffered the terrible effects that Mrs. Cora Llopis endured until her death a few days after being rescued. Due to the severity of her condition, it was practically impossible to obtain a statement from her. However, one piece of information that proved extremely useful was related to the recent death of her mother in a fire that kept her in agony for more than a week. This event is considered relevant as it supports the hypothesis that access to trauma may have triggered the effect of the real in the room. Regarding the study of the room itself, once authorization was obtained from the competent authorities in Marseille, an invasive intervention was conducted on the 3rd floor of the pension. For 5 days, the characteristics of each of the rooms in the 3 apartments were studied. Upon intervening in the room where Mrs. Cora Llopis was located, the team concluded that the way to counteract the darkness effect in the room involved the direct application of 750,000 lumens, which made it possible to see Mrs. Llopis and remove her from the bed, where she lay with minimal vital sign. Despite the cost involved in applying such a large amount of lumens, it was suggested to maintain the 3rd floor and the dark room with as many light sources as possible. This was because the reaction of this indeterminate darkness tended to diminish its effects the lighter it received over an extended period. Although the physical mechanism by which this was possible is unknown, it was determined that this significantly helped to visualize key elements inside, such as the bed. This made it possible to remove anyone who had the misfortune of being trapped there.
Given the development and proliferation of communication media, as well as the increase in pilgrimages, the phenomena of apparitions quickly take on a national and even global dimension. So a decision regarding a diocese can have consequences in places far removed from where the apparition was recorded and studied. Since angelic apparitions suffer from the problem of physical indeterminacy, their classification and verification of authenticity become complex. Additionally, the impact that contact with an angelic being might provoke in contemporary society results in a serious conflict within the social framework and the fabric that supports a pluralistic world. The protocol, pending approval, was finalized in 1992 in its alternative version for exclusive circulation within authorized personnel in Vatican City. Any attempt to disseminate the material must have the approval of the reigning Holy Father. From creation and throughout the history of salvation, we find them, announcing from afar or nearby that salvation and serving the divine plan for its realization. They close the earthly paradise, protect Lot, save Hagar and her son, stop Abraham's hand. The law is communicated through their ministry. They lead the people of God, announce births and vocations, assist the prophets, etc. According to doctrine, angels are spiritual beings created by God, possessing intelligence and will, but lacking a physical body. They are messengers and servants of God, tasked with carrying out His orders in the universe. Unlike humans, angels are immortal and not subject to the physical limitations of the material world. Their categories are varied according to their function in God's service. However, it cannot be said that all angels serve in the same manner. There may be categories not yet understood by the Church, which include those who have served purposes related to destiny and death. God's designs may be subject to angelic intervention if so ordained, which could lead to the corruption of the angelic substance under certain circumstances. Despite extensive documentation throughout history, in testimonies and artistic representations, the Vatican knows, through its experts and divine grace, that angelic forms cannot be unequivocal. This means there is no definitive way to represent what an angel is. Due to their transcendental characteristics and the lack of earthly physical properties, an angel can be perceived in different ways, with even invisible manifestations being a possibility. However, due to the proliferation of technology and the widespread use of devices such as cameras, it has become more necessary than ever to have a protocol that protects humans from contact with angels that might be processed in other spectrums of light. There are several encounters verified by the Church regarding apparitions of angelic beings throughout history. Among them we can find Annunciation to the Virgin. The angel Gabriel appeared to the Virgin Mary to announce that she had been chosen by God to be the mother of Jesus, the Savior. Although the manifestation as an animal or a form of luminous energy is debatable, it is possible that Gabriel also entered Mary's psyche through dreams and introduced the apodictic certainty of the event. On the other hand, it cannot be ruled out that the message was not delivered with the fidelity mentioned in the Bible due to the angelic corruption that some messengers suffer. The encounter with Daniel. Another manifestation of Gabriel appeared to the prophet Daniel to explain prophetic visions concerning the future of Israel and the coming of the Messiah. Gabriel gave Daniel understanding of the divine plan and the events to come. At the tomb. The appearance of an angel at Jesus' tomb after his resurrection is recorded as one of the most significant after the Annunciation. According to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, an angel appeared to the women who went to Jesus' tomb on Easter Sunday, and announced that he had risen, transcending his nature and thus initiating the new era of Christianity. Phenomena such as alleged apparitions, visions, internal or external locutions, writings or messages, phenomena related to religious images, and psychophysical phenomena often transcend the limits of everyday experience and appear to originate from a supernatural source. Describing such events precisely may exceed the capabilities of human language. The church's pastors are called to handle these events with care, which means appreciating their outcomes, purifying them of negative elements, or warning the faithful of the dangers they pose. When physical and psychic phenomena accompany certain spiritual experiences and cannot be immediately explained through reason alone, it is the church's responsibility to undertake careful study and discernment of these phenomena. The primary method for this is discernment cultivated through prayer. The divine gift that helps the church's pastors examine everything according to the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, where the norm for proceeding with supernatural phenomena is promulgated. Due to the enormous difficulty this entails and the few verified proofs by the church, contact with divine beings, beyond being exclusive and specific, is extremely complex. Angelic beings need to be viewed with the utmost caution to protect them from skeptical masses and media exploitation, as well as the possibility that their manifestation might be recorded according to human physical limitations. For instance, an angelic entity would find it futile to communicate a message through a supernova explosion or via ultraviolet radiation transmission. A precise and simple manifestation is necessary. However, these forms can be extremely dangerous if not received with due care. The church has confirmed that the great disaster of Sodom and Gomorrah was caused by the instability in the nature of the angels who visited Lot, provoking a disaster that has been misinterpreted both in the Bible and in historical studies. Since 1953, the Holy See has established a protocol for the containment of angelic entities that can be apprehended both through reason and material means. In 1949, Giovanni di Petri, an Italo-Argentine priest, utilized a 1905 French papillon camera as the first method to capture an entity corrupted by physical laws. As a result, scientists working in the Vatican have produced a series of devices that allow for containment, both by being seen by the human eye and by the trap of photography itself. Following this procedure, the essence of the entity is encapsulated in the K521 chamber, located under St. John's Tower in Sector 12. There, since 1955, they have been under permanent observation, and thanks to the efforts of the Vatican's scientific team, it has been possible to establish the first intentional interactions with these entities.
Vediamo, vuoi presentarti con un nome davanti a noi? Ti staremo ascoltando e registrando. Quali sono le tue intenzioni con la tua presentazione davanti a noi? Potresti descriverci la tua natura? Per favore, procedi e cerca di comunicare con noi. Puoi adottare il nostro linguaggio in modo che possiamo capirti.
He had been nicknamed the Traveler since the first time they saw him wandering around Maksimirska Avenue at number 3200 in the heart of Zagreb. It was never known how he ended up in such conditions, taking shelter from the sun's rays and the morning frosts in a huge blue canvas tent hidden in an alley. It was known from comments by avid specialists who frequented the clinic 2 blocks away that the Traveler suffered from a condition called chronic delusional state of messianic character. The man believed himself to be a nautical traveler. In fact, he sometimes called himself the reincarnation of Marco Polo. Everything in his life revolved around that. Even the tent that was his refuge seemed clumsily to imitate the shape of the bow of an ancient ship. Next to him, one could sometimes see one or another stray dog, which disappeared as soon as the Traveler had nothing left to eat. However, what never left him was an old BlackBerry that the man used to consult in whispers, as if it were an intercommunicating compass. With his sudden death a few days ago, it was impossible not to be shocked. Although he used to get involved in street fights and smell of fear, the neighbors had taken a certain liking to him. On a couple of occasions, he used his BlackBerry to prevent a robbery on one of the corners of Maksimirska Avenue, hitting the thief on the head. And that device now lay in my hands, as the Traveler's last wish. The story of how it happened was somewhat sudden. I was coming out of the cafe in front of the office where I worked as an accountant for a company, as usual. The Traveler was running frantically, with a disturbed and terrified look on his face. Although apparently no one was chasing him, at least in the real world, he said to me in a voice so clear and with an accent that I would never have expected from a vagabond, "Do not let it fall into the wrong hands." Since then, we never saw him again. The police declared him dead after finding a body floating in the river, which matched the few more detailed physical descriptions that existed of the Traveler. The death certificate stated his cause of death as drowning, and his body had self-inflicted scratches from the neck to the sternum. No one claimed the body. Trusting the Traveler's word before he left this world, I kept his BlackBerry on my bedroom desk. However, I felt the need to call the police and tell them what the man had said to me. Furthermore, I possessed one of the case's pieces of evidence. As often happens in these types of cases, as the officer who answered my call described it, sometimes there are deaths that nobody cares about, and cases that remain archived forever, with no relatives claiming them at all. The officer gave me 2 options regarding the BlackBerry. Either I kept it and nothing happened, or I handed it over to the police and still nothing happened, quite literally. I decided to respect the Traveler's last wish and left it there in the drawer, waiting for the weekend to take a closer look at it. To the touch, it seemed like an ordinary mobile phone, a bit dirty, scratched on the back. Naturally, and as I expected, the battery was dead, so I got a cable from an acquaintance to charge it. It took an eternity to reach 50%, but at least it seemed like it still worked. After midnight, the phone finally finished charging, and I decided to turn it on, hoping not to find anything that would put me in an illicit position. The phone took its time to react. A rounded figure kept spinning around itself while gradually turning a subtle green. It was possibly the first time anyone had turned it on. So, about 20 or 30 minutes passed until the screen went black again. Exhausted and fed up with waiting, considering also that I had to wake up early the next day, I casually threw the phone into the drawer. There it stayed until early Thursday morning, when a deafening electronic screech woke me up, and in my startled state, I remembered that the traveler's BlackBerry was still there, still powered on, trapped on my desk. I tried every possible way to stop the noise. I pressed all its buttons, especially the red one, which I assumed should turn it off, but nothing worked. The phone continued like this for a few minutes until it decided to stop. I couldn't tell if it was due to some special character combination or if it simply had some kind of automated alarm. But I did notice that on the huge screen, a map was drawn in black background and white lines with a flickering red dot in its center. I could barely make out the street names, but none of them seemed familiar to me. At the bottom edge, also in very small letters, were two boxes. One was labeled Great Attractor and the other Anomaly of Indetermination. My first thought was that it might be some game native to the BlackBerry, or some demonstration application of the new real-time geolocation capabilities that had begun to become popular on mobile devices. But the interface felt so strange that the idea of it being some kind of tutorial quickly vanished from my consciousness. Due to time constraints, I had to leave the phone in the drawer once again, but with the promise that I would come back to it later as soon as I clocked out of work. There was only a map. And unlike the last time I saw it, this time it did indicate familiar coordinates, which happened to closely resemble those of my neighborhood. But something about it gave it an appearance that I struggled to fully recognize beyond the street names. I found it impossible to access any sort of menu, and likewise couldn't manage to turn off the mobile or use it outside of the map. That flashing red dot was now situated to one side, precisely at the intersection of the streets near my home. So I surmised that it was somehow showing me my position on the map. I confirmed this by stepping out onto the street and walking a few paces north, and the dot seemed to track my movements. Back in my room, I decided to research the geolocation features of BlackBerry devices, as well as any applications that might have certain similarities. But nothing. Not even in cases of malfunction did the map resemble that of the traveler's mobile, nor did it have the integrated dark mode that the newer models boasted. After staring at the map for a while, I became curious and decided to press the box labeled Great Attractor, simply because the other option, Indetermination Anomaly, didn't give me any ideas at all. When I pressed the box, nothing happened for about 30 seconds, until a notification in the middle of the screen displayed the following message: "Follow your desires." The phrase seemed as confusing as the entire situation, and apparently nothing on the screen had changed. Except for something I noticed the next night when I took the BlackBerry out of my desk drawer. On the map, much further north, there was another red dot, but it wasn't flashing. Since I didn't know the streets around that point, I couldn't tell if it marked any familiar location. So I thought of something that might help. I would take the BlackBerry to my office and try to determine the new point's relative position to my house from there. It's worth noting that by then, the phone didn't seem to be running out of battery. The number of hours it had been on made me think that the map demanded very little energy from the phone. Contrary to what I thought, the point neither approached nor moved away when I reached my office. In fact, it disappeared. So, I had nothing to do but constantly check for its reappearance. But nothing happened until I returned home, specifically when I entered my room. There, the point returned, in the exact same place where I first saw it. I thought with little conviction that perhaps it was something in my surroundings, something that was giving it some kind of energy, but I couldn't think of anything. I felt like it could be something like a puzzle, but it didn't make sense. It was just a damn cell phone from a simple vagabond in the city center. It was at that moment that I decided to go out to the balcony of my room, lit a cigarette, and stayed there, watching the nighttime panorama of the city. Everything was so quiet, and the cold breeze of autumn was occasionally felt. Until I saw those shadowy figures, elongated and with a head that resembled a huge anvil. For a moment, I thought they might be some telecommunications towers, but I cleared my view a bit, and they still looked like organic figures, but in shadow. Both figures were motionless several blocks away on a building that stood out from the others. They must have been large enough for me to appreciate their shapes in such detail. I thought about checking the map on the BlackBerry. The scene was so strange that the first thing that came to mind was the most unusual thing that had happened to me in recent days. And there it was, the second red dot, the one that didn't blink, in the same direction as the two black figures seemed to be. I tried to estimate the possible distance on the map from the city, and they were really far away. I could see them from a 20th floor, which gave me a huge advantage in city visualization. Suddenly, that screech, similar to an alarm, shook the mobile again. But this time, a text balloon appeared above the map, with the following phrase: Initialization of extraction. From that moment, I don't remember anything else. It was as if I had fallen asleep without noticing the signals from my own body, or not even really like that sensation. I simply felt myself fading away, and in a brief lapse of time, I found myself lying in a hospital ward, but only for a moment, until everything went black again and time passed very, very slowly there. It felt like an eternity in a dream that seemed as dull and static as a turned-off screen. When I regained consciousness, I saw my parents and my sister surrounding me. I was still in the hospital, and they were looking at me with tears in their eyes. I didn't know why they weren't happy to see me. In fact, they covered their eyes and kept lamenting. It was difficult to understand what had happened to me, as well as to reintegrate into the world. After a few weeks, one of the doctors provided me with a large mirror, where they hoped I would be able to process my accident. I didn't know what to think. I didn't understand anything, until I saw it. I saw myself covered in metal amalgams, which covered half of my face, my entire left arm, part of my abdomen, and my right leg up to the ankle. I was lying there with my body partially paralyzed, in a state impossible to understand. I can only say, and I still don't fully understand it, that parts of my body transformed into tissues of heavy metal alloys, as if it were some kind of biomechanical casing. However, this seemed to have no usefulness at all, as much of it began to rust upon contact with my blood, making it even a danger to myself. Here I am, still trying to understand what I am and what I have become, and most importantly, why this happened to me. For now, I will wait for the arrival of a very famous specialist who believes he has the answer, a certain Jacques-Alain Miller.
Encuentra aquí una primera respuesta. Encuentra una primera respuesta cuando uno admite la definición del inconsciente como un saber. Ella ha dicho el viernes que eso supone que de no confundir saber y conocimiento.
For David Corello, 37, The terrifying symptoms began on a winter day in Edmonton. I simply woke up and was sitting on the couch watching TV when my roommate walked into the room, and looking at him I thought, what am I seeing? Then his girlfriend walked in, and her face was the same. That was Corello's testimony to the psychiatrists at the General Continuing Care Center. Each of the once familiar faces had a grotesque grimace, elongated eyes, and deeply etched scars. When turned to the side, pointy ears suddenly appeared, said Corello, who couldn't understand what was happening around him. I tried to explain to my roommate what I was seeing, and he thought I was crazy. Then I went outside, and all the faces of the people I saw were distorted and still are, said Corello. It's like staring at demons, he added. Imagine waking up one morning and suddenly everybody in the world looks like a creature from a horror movie. David Corello, who was attended and examined by the Lacanian Studies Department of the Real, was diagnosed with a rare condition called prosopomatometamorphopsia, or PMO, in which parts of other people's faces appear distorted in shape, texture, position, or color. However, objects and other parts of a person's body generally remain unchanged. Psychiatrists, neurologists, and psychologists, under the remote supervision of Jacques-Alain Miller, worked together regarding what could be an unknown manifestation until then of the effects of jouissance on vision provoked by some traumatic experience. Corello also commented, "What people don't understand from a picture is that the distorted face is moving, contorting, talking to you, making facial gestures. In some way, it distances me a bit from other people. I try not to let that happen, because I know what it is. It's PMO. However, I still feel like I'm not getting as close to people as I used to, because somehow I feel a lot of fear when observing them. I've lived my whole life as a normal person. So imagine suddenly seeing that everyone is some sort of humanoid strangers with horrendous expressions." Prosopomatometamorphopsia is different from face blindness, the condition that gained fame due to actor Brad Pitt, and which perhaps as many as 1 in 50 people suffer from to some degree. In face blindness, faces are not distorted. Instead, the brain simply has trouble recognizing faces, both in complete and partial ways, even familiar faces, making nearly everyone strangers. However, with PMO, a person often will have little trouble recognizing a loved one or familiar face, but that face will be distorted, often in predictable ways, following some common pattern. For me, the basic distortions are the same for each person, with the lines on the face, the elongation of the eyes and mouth, and the pointy ears. But the size and shape of a person's face or head and how they move can be different and change the distortion. Some people with PMO see their own faces as distorted or even damaged. 2 patients, while standing in front of the mirror, saw how their eyes changed position on their faces, indicating a sort of transfiguration of their own features, according to an April 2023 literature review. For others with the condition, like David, the entire face of another person appears deformed, with classic features akin to what could be termed as faces of terror or monstrous. Meanwhile, others with the same condition have reported seeing only half of the face as twisted or malformed. A 53-year-old Scottish woman, after a tumor was removed from the left side of her brain, described the right side of her doctor's face where his eye had transformed into a huge hole that seemed to absorb everything around it. Likewise, her lower teeth were 3 times the normal size for a human. Additionally, she said she had seen the doctor sometimes with ears and other times with a completely flat head. Among the cases studied by Professor Miller's team, people have described faces transforming into dragons or fish heads, or where ears protrude from the top of people's heads. Others report seeing shortened arms attached to faces, people's eyes bulging out like snails or levitating around their heads. The woman who saw dragons began seeing them as a child, So there are developmental cases of PMO, in which people grow up with the condition and don't know that faces should look different, said Brodier Korolka, professor of psychological and brain sciences at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. According to a review from June 2017, there are only 13 cases of PMO in the published literature that may be related to phenomena of the real. But it is likely that there are many more people living with the condition, said Jacques-Alain Miller, author of the case study at the Lacanian School of Paris. With so little knowledge available, many people who have accessed the register of the real may be misdiagnosed with schizophrenia or other similar hallucinatory conditions and be medicated with antipsychotics or even institutionalized, said Antonio de Souza Menendez, a psychoanalysis student at the Brazilian Freudo-Lacanian School. Since, according to studies by the late Jacques Lacan, the real can be accessed, mainly partially, so cases of alienation are even rarer and present developments that end up physically affecting people. Diagnosed with bipolar disorder as a teenager, David Corello struggled with mental illnesses that intensified and turned into post-traumatic stress disorder after an accident that nearly cost him his life on a highway outside Vancouver. I was in the famous 23 fuel truck incident. Everyone knows what happened there and what some of the survivors had to go through. I still struggle to get those scenes of horror out of my head, he said. As part of his coping, Corello has been a longtime member of a Facebook support group. Growing increasingly fearful of what was happening to him after the distortions began, he posted his symptoms online. I feel like I'm shutting down, like I'm living in some kind of parallel reality. Every face I see that's not on a screen looks evil, twisted, and demented. I mean, literally, it's like everyone has vanished, and I find myself trapped, surrounded by beings I don't know at all, he wrote in January 2020. When my travels to Buenos Aires became much more frequent due to work and mainly academic matters, I had the opportunity to firsthand experience the impact of Jacques Lacan's teachings in Argentina. Likewise, my friendship with Mrs. Diana Rabinovich allowed, in her immense generosity regarding my dissemination work of Parisian psychoanalysis, to approach many other men and women who were dedicated to studying the phenomenon of the real in a particular manner. Among them, I found a significant number of Brazilian psychoanalysts who, due to various circumstances, ended up developing their careers in Argentine lands. Kleber de Amaral was one of them, very close to Mrs. Rabinovich as well as to the board of the Lacanian Orientation School. Kleber also knew Matthias de Souza Bruckner, who led years ago the only expedition of our discipline to the depths of the Amazon, of which possibly not many have been aware due to the difficulties in publishing the original manuscripts and transcribing Jacques Lacan's interventions in Caracas. Such was the uproar of the expedition's results at the time, that the European Psychoanalytic Association took part in a sanctioned note towards the Brazilian Academy for improperly intervening in the investigative work that had been carried out until then on behalf of psychoanalysis. Unfortunately, Jacques Lacan passed away a few months after his only conference in Latin America. Had that happened about 10 years earlier, we would have had material of utmost interest for the Lacanian cause. It is, inspired by that scenario, that accompanied by Kleber de Amaral and Professor Emiliano Ritter, of whom I will make solemn mention in his memory later on, we embarked on the reissue of the expedition that in 1979 was made with unexpected and enlightening results about the nature of the purest and wildest state of what has been defined, with some difficulty, as the real. However, I must make a point of detail. Our expedition took place in much more remote lands than those traveled by Professor de Souza Bruckner. to which we were recommended to enter from the Peruvian routes, taking advantage that in the same year, I speak of 2004, we were invited together with Mrs. Rabinovich to an international symposium on psychoanalysis at the Cayetano Heredia Peruvian University, where we also presented the first volume translated into Spanish of the unpublished corpus on the neurology project proposed by Henri Poisser and completed 3 years later, in 1958, by Donald Winnicott. It was in a small cafe on Carlos Basadre Street in Lima where I met Kleber de Amaral after our first conversation in Buenos Aires. A week before we began our journey to the Brazilian Amazon, Kleber handed me extensive documentation that had been compiled between 2001 and 2003 by scholars from the Brazilian Psychoanalysis Association, who decided to continue analyzing Matthias de Souza Bruckner's reports, making between 8 to 10 trips to the state of Acre, where vast historical descriptions suggested the existence of tribes sharing similar characteristics with those visited and studied in 1979. Kleber de Amaral was interested in me joining at least one of the expedition caravans and, due to my well-known relevance in the dissemination of Lacanian studies, considering this a unique opportunity for the academic development of the matter concerning the real, bringing both his team's preliminary conclusions and mine to meetings in New York and Paris. I must emphasize that in these latter places, there was little news of Latin American research on the development of psychoanalysis, which, as Mrs. Rabinovich told me, were often dismissed from the general forum discussion, relegated to secondary discussion tables, and, honestly, aroused little interest among the few attendees. We decided that a good starting date for our journey would be the first weeks of March, to thus avoid the harsh storms that often hinder the crossing through the Amazonian border between Peru and Brazil. Our journey took 3 days, during which we had to traverse the rugged slopes where the Andes Mountains kiss the virgin jungle and merge into a thick blanket of vegetation and untamed nature. Crossing the border on the only plane connecting the Peruvian city of Pucallpa, the last urban oasis, to Tarauacá Airport in Brazilian lands. Once there, we faced a 4-hour car trip to the town of Cruzeiro do Sul, where we would be staying with Kleber de Amaral, Emiliana Ritter, and the guides from the Brazilian Association. During the journey, we were not immune to unforeseen events. Emiliana Ritter suffered a serious setback due to his diabetes. It was as unforeseen as the journey itself that we had embarked onto the Amazon. Our trip experienced a slight delay with the return to Tarauacá, where Emiliano stayed for 2 nights until local doctors advised him to seek assistance in Lima. My friend's decision was risky, knowing his health condition. But he did well to take the first flight to the Peruvian capital, and from there, not many days later, returned to Rosario and take care of his diabetes. The mishap kept us on edge until Mrs. Rabinovich, who was still in Lima, notified us, with certain days of delay naturally, that Emiliana Ritter had crossed the border in good condition and had already been assisted at the General Hospital. Only then could we consider our expedition to have begun. Kleber de Amaral had mentioned to me that we would visit an indigenous settlement in the locality of Bom Jesus, about a 2-hour journey by montaria, a type of rustic canoe made from ceibo wood, which due to its properties would allow us to ford the irregular courses of the Rio Azul. That was the only way to get there. As one would expect on trips like this, the journey took us almost twice the budgeted time. The late summer rains had considerably widened the riverbed just a few days before our arrival in Brazil, and any attempt to speed up the pace could have caused an unnecessary tragedy. Bom Jesus was the administrative name given by the state of Acre to a locality delineated only on maps and in demographic records. The indigenous community there hadn't even given a name to the land they inhabited, and were it not for the peace agreements of 1956, to this day they would be unaware of being part of a nation, even if they were completely unaware of such a concept and many others. My first encounter with the community was surprisingly more pleasant than I expected. It seems that both Kleber and our companions from the association had been engaging in long conversations with the indigenous people for some time through excellent translators. They were even aware that more people would come to study their customs, traditions, and stories about beyond the river, which was the way to refer to those sacred phenomena they had worshipped for countless ages. It was more than pleasing to know that they never exhibited aggressive behavior. In fact, Kleber had mentioned to me during our conversation at the cafe in Lima that some of the indigenous people were so excited about the arrival of foreign men that, contrary to what one might think, many of them believed they were being rescued from the Urksel. Days later, I would understand the fear of these men. Kleber de Amaral kindly introduced me to some of the tribe's leaders, who stood out from the others by their long black robes and pompous ornaments hanging from their necks. Apparently, any group that managed to communicate with the Urksal and not suffer the unknown consequences of contact claimed the right to make the most important decisions for the tribe. However, leading the group meant testing their physical and mental strength with each full moon, when they had to return to the Urkel and attempt to hunt it down. For this reason, tribal chieftains rarely remained in their position for more than 2 or 3 moons. On my second day in Bom Jesus, Kleber and some translators invited me to explore some of the rarities hidden in the vast Amazon. Not much further to the north, the indigenous people had discovered, hidden by the thick tangle of roots and branches, true walls of undocumented fortifications. Hundreds of stone blocks rose to a height of 6 to 8 meters. Some of these seemed to have been cut in series with precise angles, which I would dare to say could be millimeter straight. Others, on the other hand, took more irregular shapes, but followed patterns reminiscent of stalagmites, also rising as enormous walls in small caves. The indigenous people believed that this was the work of Urksal, because for them, the universe was the result of its existence and will. With this discovery, I began to notice that the tribe exhibited certain traits similar to monotheism. However, as would become clear to me in the coming days, Urksal was not a traditional deity in the most academic sense of the term, but rather a cosmic force that, in its omnipotence, had created that wild and impenetrable world to test its own existence through punishments and horrors to those who were condemned to survive in its mazes. In the following days, together with Kleber, Renan, one of the translators, and accompanied by some men from the tribe, we made several trips on Monteria towards the east, following the course of the Blue River until reaching an area where the jungle seemed to open up, and the river turned into a wide expanse of dark waters. The indigenous people told us that for them, the world ended when the arboreal prison came to an end, where Urksal had poisoned the sky, the waters, and the land. And that version held much truth. At that point in the river, the current had become slow and thick at the touch of the oar. The waters suddenly turned black and oily as if it were petroleum. Likewise, on the banks, massive mounds of dark ground crowned with perfect golden blocks stacked haphazardly on top of each other. The indigenous people warned us that these were nothing more than illusions, a vile mirage of Urksal to trap any outsider into his labyrinth. These formations were even found in small cavernous entrances hidden where the river narrowed again, arranged like sacred jaws. It struck me that the men of the tribe, under the assumption that their deity was a product of folkloric magical thinking, were aware that men from more advanced civilizations were extremely vulnerable to the allure of gold. For most of my stay with the tribe, I must confess, I remained respectfully skeptical. In my thoughts, every story was nothing more than the product of their obvious isolation and the limited socio-cognitive development of the indigenous people. This became evident when studying their cosmological understanding and the simplicity with which everything was resolved, both from what prompted certainty as well as ignorance to the figure of Urksal. I even dared to think that their docile behavior and apparent good faith were nothing more than the expression of a previous state, of a certain primitivism of the cerebral structures that make man prone to suspicion. My musings on their traditions, to my chilling surprise, came to an abrupt end on the 5th day of the expedition. It was here that all my years of exhausting study were revealed to me from the underestimated experience of trauma. In the inevitable contact with that reality that subsists in the deepest recesses of the world, where for primitive man it manifests in incomprehensible forms, and from there arise, in an attempt to symbolize them, all kinds of deities and specters. It happened on the last journey of our expedition, following the current north of Bom Jesus to the place where men feared to cross. The itinerary of that day included a visit to the border of the known world, where Urkshol became inevitable. It took us about 5 hours to reach the point marked as the portal, where huge towers appeared without warning, which, making a visual estimate, reached 40 or 50 meters in height. Bearing a particular resemblance to ciliary structures, they rose from the lushness of the jungle in various shapes and textures. Some, I could even assure, had been constructed with corroded metals of complex elaboration. The indigenous people feared these towers, claiming that they were the ever-watchful eyes of Urkshol, lover of lightning and storms. Nothing that appeared before me made any sense. I was absolutely certain that in nature, no structure could take such a form, and that if built by humans, it would require at least some capacity in intellect and motor skills to raise such a rarity. In that moment of ecstasy, Renan interrupted my confused thoughts to ask me, through the intermediary of the accompanying indigenous person, if I wished to descend into the lands of Urkshol and thus gather some records and take unprecedented photographs. I returned the question with the apprehension that whatever inhabited beyond implied a danger of certain irresponsibility. However, it had been a night of the new moon. On the other side of the river, the jungle began to constrict again, and unlike the rest of the days when we went out to explore the jungle, we all had to carry an oar to mark the land every 50 steps we took north, until we reached 250. Although the men of the tribe possessed a basic mechanism for counting numbers and understanding the abstraction of mathematics, Renan told me that it had not been too difficult to agree that, through the symbolic transaction of signals, it was possible to infer what such and such quantity meant for the indigenous people. At first, I thought that the prohibition of crossing beyond 250 steps was some arbitrary figure, but I didn't take long to realize that I was completely mistaken once again. The indigenous person warned us that from any point when encountering the eyes of Urkshol at 250 steps in the direction we chose, the Sentinel of the lands would appear to us. A monolith of almost 3 meters with the inscribed face of Urkshol. About 3 years before having the privilege of meeting Kleber Dalmarao, Mrs. Diana Rabinovich had extended a special invitation to me. A small informal gathering among members of the psychology department at the University of Buenos Aires and guests from France and Brazil would be held at her house. There, we briefly discussed Professor de Souza Bruckner's expedition and our interest in traveling to the Amazon one day. Mrs. Rabinovich had correspondence neatly stored in her office desk. Among her hundreds of documents, she showed us several unpublished photographs from the expedition, including some that were never presented at the Caracas intervention in 1979. Most of these related to moments of relaxation and humor. Nothing too serious or truly interesting considering the significance of that milestone in psychoanalysis. But one photo caught my attention powerfully. It depicted a woman posing for the camera next to a huge monolith with exact characteristics to the one I would come face to face with 3 years later. In both, a face with humanoid features could be seen, elongated both in frontal and mandibular structure. From it, at least 100 filaments of a color ranging between garnet and purple could easily measure a meter. Its organic appearance resembled the texture and plasticity of a centipede or some microorganism with velvety membrane. Matthias de Souza Bruckner may have encountered one of Urkshol's sentinels almost 20 years earlier. I asked through Renan if I was allowed to approach the monolith somewhat in order to examine it more closely. The indigenous people responded fearfully that merely being in the place already posed a certain risk, and that it would never be a good decision to insinuate any intention in front of Urxel's emissaries. Somehow, perhaps Renan, one of the indigenous people, or myself, accidentally crossed the last and forbidden frontier. Moved by some kind of force that altered our perception, will, and memory, we ventured into the jungle with a fervent interest in joining its heart. The vague memories of those moments bring to mind the sensation of burning throughout my body and an uncontrollable thirst. I experienced an intrinsic yet corrupted impulse to seek truth within the jungle until we encountered the entity that will be attached following this paragraph. The imminent danger possibly triggered Renan's return to that state of impulsiveness. His shouts in front of my face were the first thing I remembered before regaining full consciousness. However, as the following photographs demonstrate, my memory has fragmented into two scenarios that anxiously overlap. The first of which confronts me with Renan in a desperate attempt to grab my arm, insisting that we should flee from there as soon as possible, also shaking my head. The second scenario corresponds to the photograph's record, in which Renan and one of the indigenous people accompany us suffer a sudden and extremely violent attack perpetrated by a figure identical to the monolith that both we and Matthias de Sosa Bruckner admired from one of the Sentinels of Urxel. The creature seemed to have completely engulfed the men's heads, preventing any reaction and will to fight against it. After the described events, my memory began to clear, and I do not know how this happened, as did my overall state of consciousness, when I found myself inside the Monteria, drinking from a coconut bowl a brew of extremely rare taste and texture, as thick as mud. One of the indigenous people insisted, amidst discrepant laughter, that I continue drinking. Renan was by my side, with the bowl nearly empty. He sweated as if consumed by fever, and his exhausted and burdened face revealed a migraine that disappeared within minutes. The journey back was much longer, or at least that's how I remember it, with my gaze sometimes lost in the vastness of the night, observing the great arm of the Milky Way veining the celestial vault. Upon our return to Bom Jesus, our initial accounts of what had happened were contradictory, to the extent that they sparked heated arguments. And so they remained for months, until at a symposium held in Buenos Aires in 2005, we came to realize that what we had experienced was undoubtedly an effect of the real. If you'd like early access to my YouTube videos, you can support me with just $5 on Patreon. There, you'll also have access to some exclusive videos. I would greatly appreciate it if you could comment, leave a like, and help spread the word about the channel to expand our community.